Today, we're thrilled to have Deborah Kilpatrick, Executive Chair, former CEO of Evidation Health, a health tech company that raised over $250 million to help analyze data from daily life and clinical sources to improve health management and treatment. Welcome, Deborah. Awesome having you here.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me, Alejandro.
Yes, we're very excited. Oh, nice.
Sound effects. I do something here, Deb.
When I switch to the introductions, I put on my radio voice. No, I don't. All right. So I'm Alejandro Garcia-Amaya, founder of Techstars Alumni and AnswerBite. My co-host is my brother, Ricardo, fellow seasoned venture-backed tech founder who leads a number of powerful Silicon Valley communities, including Alumni Founders, a community of 3,000 Y Combinator alumni. Deborah, our community is, I'm sure you've heard of Techstars, Y Combinator, made up of top 1% venture-backed tech founders in the world.
I've heard of it a few times.
So we're gonna leave about 10 minutes towards the end for any Q&A, and then we'll go from there. We'll cover a number of lessons, including when it comes to building and scaling and product and everything in between, and I'm going to share a little bit more on your background, Deb, and then we'll jump into the questions. So just hang tight for a second here. So as mentioned, Deborah is the executive chair and former CEO of Evidation Health with a rich medtech background starting at, I'm going to butcher this name, Guidant?
Guidant.
Okay. Guidant Corporation. Guidant. She's held pivotal roles, notably leading to groundbreaking developments before Boston Scientific acquisition. She serves on the boards of Sleep Number and Sutter Health, and esteemed fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering. She's also the inaugural female chair of Georgia Tech's College of Engineering Advisory Board. Her contributions to digital health innovation earned her a spot in San Francisco's Business Times 100 Most Influential Women in Business, the Silicon Valley Business Journal's 100 Women of Influence, Fierce Medical Devices Top 100 Women in MedTech, and Forbes 50 Over 50, and on. Again, thank you so much. I'm going to jump now into Evidation Health. So for those who have never heard of Evidation Health, can you share with us, Deborah, who are its customers? What problems are you helping them solve?
Yes, thanks to everybody for the chance to talk with everybody today. It's great. So I usually answer this question in sort of the pillars of our mission, how we do it, and why does it matter? Evidation's mission is to create new ways to measure health using person-generated health data from the context of everyday life as opposed to the context of the clinical setting. So we work entirely outside of the brick and mortar walls of how people usually think about a healthcare setting. How we do that is we have a two-sided tech platform that has people and permissioned health data on one side of it and global enterprises and governments on the other side. So what our tech does and our products do is allow those enterprises to access those people and their permission data for the purposes of decentralized clinical trials, longitudinal decentralized health programs over years in some cases. And a great example of the latter is an upcoming launch that we're about to do in the UK for the largest longitudinal research program ever undertaken there, involving up to 5 million people across the United Kingdom. And that program is called Our Future Health, and we are the tech layer that interacts between the data flow and all of the interaction and engagement with those people over time. The why does it matter part is something I like to make sure I point out, which is, something that we know, but we don't usually think about, which is everyday health experiences, which is the dominant part of most of our health experiences, really are invisible. They're invisible to the system. And there are missed opportunities to measure health because of that. And if there's missed opportunities to measure health, there's missed opportunities to improve it. And so we really focus on developing a secret sauce over time that has us in having a lot of expertise in person-generated health data from wearables, from sensors, from all other kinds of data that can be generated and permissioned at the node of the individual. Because if you can do that, then you can holistically characterize health as opposed to just data from inside the clinic characterizing it.
All right, so I love this, and I want to be able to break it up in a couple of areas because this is fascinating. How did you come across, first off, this idea? That's one question, and the second following that is, where did you decide to get started when you're talking about those two different types of audiences?
It's a great question because multi-sided platforms are notoriously difficult to start. So let me answer the first part first, which is, why the idea? Well, we really felt when I met the current CEO and my co-founder, Christine Lemke, 10 years ago, actually almost, 10 years ago now, we were both very interested in this idea that in the digital era of medicine, you ought to be able to measure health like purely digitally, like really as an aspiration when you're outside the clinic. And there wasn't a company that was really doing that yet. And so we wanted to do that. And we were very interested in the idea that if you could do that, that there are multiple use cases, products, and stakeholders who would have an interest in that. It's sort of the person-generated health data analog in some ways to the advent of the genomic era and the consumer genetics era, where there was all of a sudden this new set of information that was available to characterize health, and there would be a number of different stakeholders to participate in that, but you needed an ecosystem, you needed a platform, you needed a way to bring that, in this case, people and permission data together so that you could actually put products on top of that as sort of the fabric. And so our first and our legacy business, our first product, our legacy business, which we still run to this day, is really about research, decentralized research, and doing that largely in what's known in healthcare as the post-approval setting. So after products have been approved, they've been launched, and now they're in broad use in the population. There's a lot of interest in trying to understand, are they behaving as well? Are they providing the same level of benefit in the real world use after they've been approved and launched versus what we saw in the clinical trials? And over time, especially over the last 10 years, there's a new body of evidence that the FDA and other stakeholders are particularly interested in called real world evidence. And that's the landscape that we play in, is generating that kind of real world evidence of product benefit alongside evidence of real world characterization of health, because they go hand in hand in healthcare.
So
what's an example of these products? Or
so so in our case, you mean the products that are being evaluated, or
Correct.
our products? Yeah, the products that are being evaluated. Anything that is used in the ecosystem of healthcare, whether it's a med tech product like a total knee or a total hip implant, or whether it's a therapeutic like a pill that you take. Are those products providing the same level of anticipated benefit based on the clinical trial data? Is that actually happening in the real world? There's a lot of people and companies that care about that, from the companies that manufacture and commercialize those products all the way through to the insurance companies that pay for them. And so there's a tremendous amount of growing interest over the last decade and now, in the coming years, to use this kind of data generated virtually and in a decentralized way in the real world for all kinds of opportunities and use cases and stakeholder interest in the healthcare ecosystem across the life cycle of a drug, for example, across the life cycle of an implant, for example.
And before Evidation Health, what were their options? Because that makes complete sense, right? A drug goes out, it passes through all those phases, and now you're trying to understand how effective it actually is. What did companies before Evidation Health? Like what were the options?
So historically, like going like really back, 10, 20 years ago, before electronic health records were widely adopted and widely available, you really were pretty much stuck with what were known as surveillance programs, which could have been mandated by the FDA using patient diaries and patient surveys.
Wow.
And physician surveys, things like that, written down documents flying around, as well as what's known as large-scale registries. So oftentimes, for example, after a drug or a device was in broad use, the company that is the manufacturer of that product, in order to understand how it was being used or not in the actual commercial setting, would conduct registries, which is the sort of going out to brick and mortar clinical sites and taking data based on how that product is being used, whether or not patients are benefited from it. But again, it's huge amounts of written down data, right?
Got it.
Which is a scalability issue, and also very importantly, that kind of data is typically only being representative and reflective of people who have access and are being cared for at a tier 1 research institution, which is the minority of the population, right?
Wow.
And so it was a heavily biased set of information. And then over time, as digital data and electronic health records became more available, real world data began to include digital sets of claims data from insurance companies and digital sets of electronic health records. In our view, that's still a limited view, though. That's still just getting data about health of what happened to you in a clinic setting, as opposed to what happened to me when I walked to the train station, or when I rode my bike to work, or when I'm just out doing my daily life. And that was the gap that we seek to fill.
Mm-hmm.
How did you then, thanks for that breakdown. It makes a ton of sense. How did you decide who to target first? And do you remember this? I usually, this is one of my favorite questions, was just like, do you remember who were your first participants or partners? When you're just trying to get signed up, what did that look like?
We do. We were very fortunate early on in that one of our pharma partners, very early, our very first pharma partner, was very interested in the very progressive, as I look back to 10 years later, was very interested in having us build a virtual cohort, a virtual population of, let's say, 100,000, 200,000 type 2 diabetics, in general across the US. I think in part they were curious about, like, can this be done in 2013, 2014? But also, again, pretty forward thinking, 10 years ago, they were very interested in, if that existed, what kinds of information would that population, or would those individuals permission for use? Like, could you actually do a new type of quantification and characterization of what people were doing on or off therapy as a type 2 diabetic, whether they were well controlled or not, in that condition? And so that was how it started. That was the initial seed of the population. Over time, we've gone from one therapeutic area of type 2 diabetics to covering about 40 to 50, depending on how you count things like autoimmune conditions, which can either be one giant therapeutic area or it can be many, many different ones.
On your end, Deb, was it it must have been also a hypothesis on your end to see how much people were willing to actually share too, right? Or I mean, what was the gut instinct that's like, we're pretty sure people are willing to share, and then you try it, and then you're like, oh, maybe not.
This is such an important question, and it's surprising that we don't get asked this more often. But our hypothesis, which was true, we proved was true, and is still true in the way that our platform works today. Our hypothesis was that people actually, because you hear everybody say, oh, people aren't engaged in their health. Like, we actually fundamentally disagreed with that. We just believed that, well, you're not quantifying health outside the clinic, which is where we're mostly engaged. And so our hypothesis was that if you could do that, and you could interact with people constantly in their daily life, in the healthcare context and give them something for doing something. You permission data, you get a point. You participate in a clinical trial, you get a point. And that point system accrues to CAC, or that point system can accrue to donations to their favorite charity. In other words, it's do something, get something. And we really believed that if you could get in that sort of currency and value exchange right, that would be the way to do it.
So
and
that reward system.
That is to this day how we operate. That's right.
Wow. Okay. How did you, when it comes to privacy and data, were there, I mean, there must be a slew of challenges, right? That come from that, regardless if the user says like, yeah, I'm happy to share, or I'm happy to do this to get this reward. On your end, when you're building this thing, like how do you try and override that?
Yes. So in our case, and you have to kind of like go in your mind way back to the future of 2014 era. This is pre-2016 election. This is pre-Cambridge Analytica scandal, remember, where all of a sudden the world was, and at least in the US, that was very aware of what's happening with my data. Before that, I would say there weren't a lot of companies talking about data privacy and data permissioning. Really? I mean, really, there weren't, even in healthcare. And we came out of the gate very, very vocally and very, very strongly and said, we will have a strong stance on data privacy and a strong stance on data permissioning. And we said, in a world where the data that we were dealing with, predominantly sort of person-generated health data, which is streaming data, right? Like in a world of streaming data, which again, back in 2014, everybody's wrapping their head around, it's really, really important to be able to reconsent, not just consent up front for data collection, but consent and reconsent over time for different uses of that data. Because in a streaming world, that data set's renewing every second, right? And so you're actually able to use and consent data over and over and over because you've got a constant relationship with the individual, because you're giving them total control over how that data is consented, collected, and used. And so we were honestly, I do believe we were the first health tech company to take a strong stance on that. By 2019 timeframe, so now people are widely thinking about data privacy because of what happened in the Cambridge Analytica Facebook situation during the election. People are widely talking about it. There was a group that was convened in DC with a subset of folks from the NIH, looking really at this issue of data privacy and data consent in the 21st century of clinical research, in the 21st century of medicine. And we were the private tech, we were the one tech company, non-public sector, non-government. We were the one sort of Silicon Valley company that was invited to that roundtable to give this stance, because at the time we really were the ones talking about it the most. I'm happy to say that that's no longer the case, right? There's obviously many companies that are now listening to this and taking these stances. The complexity that you point to, though, is very real. Because even within the US, you have different privacy laws, right? Some states have them, some states don't have them. Between the United States and other geographies overseas, those privacy laws can be different. And so the standards and expectations and what regulations or rules you align to, I like to call it the compliance stack. Like, right, we have a tech stack, we have a compliance stack. And in healthcare in particular, a lot of your ability to be agile and efficient and compliant is a competitive advantage based on how you've set up your compliance stack. And so that's the complication.
Go on. I know, Richie, before we go into, are you going to jump, Richie, into scaling?
No, I wanted to have a question regarding the marketplace piece. So I get the one side of it, which is the pharmaceuticals or products reaching out to you, and that I see more of maybe because the scope of the thing maybe looks very much kind of consultative type of approach with that side of the marketplace. What's the other side, and does one actually starts the other? I mean, that's how it works, right? Like the Yep, if you mind sharing like an example or a couple of examples of what that marketplace look like, who's on the other side, and
Sure.
like, do they get pinged, do they opt in, or
Sure. On the consumer side of the marketplace, yes, they're getting, when they come into the Evidation platform, they sometimes are taking different routes. A lot of them are coming in purely organically through the iOS or Android app stores. Others might be coming in inorganically because they convert in because they were in someone else's population that was a customer of ours, and then they were given the opportunity on the other side of those use cases of use of our platform, maybe a custom label version of our platform, to come into our population. They get there different ways. But in general, yes, they get pinged, right? So when they come in, they're in Gen Pop, as I like to call them. They're in Gen Pop. And then they get pinged for these opportunities to participate based on what we know about them. When they come into the population, they have the choice of turning on all these different data streams or not. They have the choice of responding to different surveys about their health conditions or not. The more we know about them, the more opportunities they have to participate in different types of decentralized trials or decentralized health programs for which they meet the inclusion criteria sponsored by the entities on the other side of the platform. And so that's the way it works. Yeah.
And I'm guessing from those rewards or transactions, is the payment coming from the entities where they
Yes.
It's like a subscription fee, or it's a rev share, or what type of?
There are many different vehicles, but yes, in general, the currency, if you will, the value transaction, if people are participating in a sponsored program, let's say over 2 to 3 years, they're getting paid for that, right? They're accruing payments for that. It's paid through us, it's paid through our platform, but it's sponsored by our customers, right? And so it's part of the contracted structure between us and our customers. And that's the way that works. Yeah. So it's like a use case specific or a product specific, interaction specific type.
And before we just jump into scaling for a second, I wanted Deb to ask you, many times startups, you have the MVP, right? Build that MVP and figure out if what you have works and get enough traction. In the health space, I haven't gone into this space, but I can assume that an MVP in the health space is very different than an MVP in other different industries. How did you know how far you can take something in order to, especially when we're talking about the privacy part of it and like compliance and all that, like how far did you have something that you're like, I think with this, we can test it. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, if we get blowback, then we figure out what our next move is.
Yeah, this is actually a real challenge in healthcare in health technology, when the regulatory or compliance environment is in flux. What you're talking about is a real challenge, because what it means is if things are in flux before you harden it into your product layer, you're going to compensate and execute it in your service layer, right? And if you're not careful about that, or you have to do that for too long before the regulations are final or the guidelines are hardened, then you're carrying your service load too high out of the, at a too high a fraction out of the tech stack. And so the art of getting to this particular question, the art is, really being able to recognize how far you can bring that service layer into the tech layer, into the product layer. And sometimes you're hedging a bet that the compliance environment isn't going to change further, right? And or you're saying, you know what? This is actually this is the limit of how far we're willing to go on the product side. We're not going to deliver something or productize something that's outside of this boundary. And so that's the art of it. And I do think that it's harder in healthcare than in other sectors because of this issue.
Totally.
Excellent.
Rick, yeah, you go for it.
Yeah. So your company has significantly scaled under your leadership, what have been your most successful channels of acquisitions? And I would imagine that, we have marketplace, but probably one comes to mind more than the other, so you can start there.
Yeah, I think, let's talk about sort of two different sides, right? Like, so on the consumer or individual, joining the population side, we have done all kinds of different things you can imagine around recruiting people into the population through different social channels. I would tell you, one of the more interesting ones, and Christine, I've heard Christine tell the story many times, is we had a co-promotion once in one of the app stores with another company, and their app was targeting people who wanted to run a 5K, who'd never been physically fit at all. And we did a co-promotion, and guess what? Those are people that are starting to interact with their health, right? Mm-hmm. They're starting to think about interactivity on an everyday life level with their health. And so that was a brilliantly successful co-promotion where we brought a lot of people into the population because of that. And so, I think that, we always talk about and have had limits, I would say some degree of success, but certainly not, we haven't tried it very broadly. To go and do things like patient advocacy organization partnerships, where they have a cohort, and do you want to have some sort of partnership where you're bringing in all those members of that particular therapeutic area or disease condition into your population? You have to be really careful with that, because you're changing context on them, right? Like you're changing context on them in terms of they may be there in that patient advocacy organization's population because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. They may feel like they're not understood. They may not be there to be part of a connected community. Do you know what I mean? And so you have to be really careful with that. But that's another tactic to employ in populations like this.
And Deb, does that when we talk about partnerships, a lot of these campaigns, what you're describing, I'm guessing a lot of them are led by the sort of organizations or corporations or pharmacies, that are looking to activate, to have access to certain type of data, private data, whatever, of people's health. Are a lot of your outbound marketing, is that tied? And maybe, in the past or now, it doesn't matter. Like, has that always been tied to the partnerships and to like what the pharmacies want? Is it like an agency model in the sense that a pharmacy comes in and they say, this is what we're willing to pay for to be able to have access to the following healthcare information, health data, and then you say, all right, we have an idea of how we can activate that group, and we're gonna like offer that within the platform? Or do all the ideas come from them, and is that a thing that actually helped, like that 5K run that you were describing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would say, let's go back like 17 years ago. The idea that you could do these decentralized research operations or decentralized health programs, I would say the market is very new in the market, right? And so we were doing a lot of ideation, right? Like with our target customers, like getting them to think about the art of the possible. That's less so the case now. They generally are approaching us because they know what information they need, or what answers they need, or what data they need. They may have an idea that we can get it, or they can work with Evidation to get it, because there's lots and lots of marketing and publications that we've done over the years that to educate the market. But to the second part of your question, they probably, for the most part, still don't understand what's under the hood. Do you know what I mean? Like, these are generally not tech companies, right? Like, it is public that we do work in the tech sector, in the consumer tech sector. That's completely different. They are very savvy, obviously. They know exactly how it works under the hood. But in general, our customers on the pure healthcare side, like pharma or med tech company, that's not their business, right? They're not experts in, even if they're experts in data science, which is generally true now versus 10 years ago. They generally all have data scientists now. They still may not understand the nuts and bolts and tactics that you deploy on a consumer tech level to interact with people, connect with them, ingest data, set up all kinds of privacy and security around that as appropriate. Like that's they really rely on us. And so, as you can imagine, in this space, we get audited pretty consistently for quality and regulatory and privacy and security. So you have to be really, really great at a lot of different things. But on the flip side, people do trust that you are. Do you know what I mean?
I wanna jump into the community building. You MedTech Women and the MedTech Vision Conference. Sure. You're one of the co-founders of it, and you're an advocate for women in technology and healthcare. I'm very curious, what inspired the creation of the event? For now it's grown. I mean, you started it in 2010, something like that. Yeah. And now it's distinguished, it's renowned. What was the reasoning behind it? And does that type of community, does that help with what Evidation is doing now, right? Are they kind of in the same realms? And had that been an idea from the beginning of fostering a community and having that community, like having the different pathways for that community to do things?
Yeah, that's, I don't know if anybody's ever asked me about this sort of intersectionality between MedTech Women, MedTech Vision, and Evidation, but I do think there's a common denominator as I listen to the question. I think the common denominator is about democratizing access to things, right? And enabling access into an ecosystem for people that previously weren't in it, right? And so, to be specific about MedTech Vision and a conference and why we started it. So at the time, go back to the time when Guidant was acquired in 2006. My co-founder Amy Raimundo and I were both at Guidant. The entire founding group of women actually that came together to kind of put that first conference on that first year, most of us had been at Guidant Corporation. Now, importantly, Guidant was at the time a Fortune 500 company. One of its main businesses was here in Santa Clara in Silicon Valley. So there was a deep sort of Silicon Valley sort of tie into the ecosystem also. And Guidant, interestingly enough, there were four divisional presidents. Two of them were female at the time we were acquired for $26 billion in 2006.
Yeah, by Boston Scientific.
By Boston Scientific. And at the time we were acquired, if you look across the entire population of the corporation, it was 56% female. And so we were very used to being in an environment, and most of us had been there for I'd been there for a decade. Like most of us had been there for a long time. The retention rate at Guidant was exceedingly high. And we weren't used to the idea that like when we heard experts, there weren't an equal amount of women that were also speaking, you know what I mean? It was a very, we were in a bubble and we didn't know it. And when Guidant was acquired and we were sort of scattered, people left and we were sort of scattered and there was sort of diaspora of ex-Guidant people. We began to get kind of out there in the broader med tech space. Some of us were venture capitalists, some of us were starting companies, some of us were going to startups, whatever. Some of us were at other large cap med tech companies. We weren't seeing women on the podium, on the proverbial podium, as much as we had been used to inside Guidant. And, we sort of noticed this multiple times. And I was sitting in a boardroom, sitting in a boardroom in a board meeting in 2010. And Amy Raimundo, who is my co-founder, who's now the managing director at Kaiser Permanente Ventures, she said, wow, what's going on here? I'm sitting at a anonymous, to be named, never named, unpublic, famous medtech conference. It's just a sea of blue and black blazers, but they're all men. Like, where are the women? And she said, and I'm like, yeah, I know. And so I'm texting her on my BlackBerry just to make it, click, 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 click. roll. And she said, we should start our own conference. We should fix this. And I'm like, yeah, we should fix this. She's like, I'm serious. And I'm like, oh, you are serious. And then we sort of did the, well, let's get together and have a drink and see if we can convince ourselves that we could actually do this. And we convinced ourselves that we could actually do it, and, kind of formed the coalition of the willing, realized we could get enough world-class experts who were female across every aspect of medtech: R&D, regulatory, clinical, policy, business people, marketing, sales, like executives. Like we really forced ourselves, like, will we be able to convene a world-class series of women on the podium that everybody should want to listen to? And we convinced ourselves who would also say yes to us, because that was the thing. Like,
that's a good question to ask. Who would say yes?
Pay them. And we convinced ourselves that yes, we could do this. And then we decided to figure out if we could raise enough sponsorship money to do it. Long story short, we figured out we thought we could do that. And so we tried it, and it worked, and here we are.
For founders that, my brothers and I, obviously we care deeply about building communities and being able to share insights from experts, right? Yeah. What someone says can be of use and help for someone else that might be going through that. And so,
yes.
For us, for others in the community that are building their own communities, even if it's a community of customers or a community, like what are some questions, or what were some things that, thinking back, you say, here are some lessons, or here are some things that I would share about if you're thinking of building this thing, right?
Yes.
Or one event a year, whatever the case might be. Were there some things that, worked for you that
yes.
Could be useful for others?
Yes. In our case, we really only had two rules. One was don't do something, and one was do something. On the don't do something, we said, you know what, we're not going to convene a conversation about work-life balance just because we're going to put women on the podium. Like, we were just absolutely not going to follow not that it's not important, but like, look, men should be talking about work-life balance too, right? Like, it's not a women's topic, and we weren't going to stereotype, the conversation, so to speak, just because we're women. So that was sort of the first rule. The second rule was we had to convene content and speakers and conversations that were relevant to what people were doing in their day jobs, because we knew, our goal and what has happened is that, look, we want people to come to this who are in the med tech sector, both in startup companies, still late stage private companies, as well as the large public companies in med tech. And we want to give them a conversation. We want to say things and provoke thought that changes the way they think about their job, right? And that was the forcing function. And so, that is content. And so, that is the thing that we've doubled down on every single time, is make it relevant. Because you know what, if it's not, people are going to stop showing up. They'll show up for the wine once, but they're not going to show up twice if it's not relevant to them and how they do their jobs. And does it make them think of things they wouldn't have thought of on their own, right? And so that's the goal, is to have a really great conversation.
I love that.
What's the one aspect that you believe that brings the highest affinity to this community, in terms of,
I think that it's people who are willing to be vulnerable in answering questions in front of an audience. Meaning, when somebody says, you did this 5 years ago and it didn't work, like the stock went down, or it didn't get through clinical trials, or everybody recognized that product portfolio, it didn't work. Why? Like, what could you have done differently? How do you think about it now? How has that experience changed what you did? And then the inverse too, like, you had this wild success. This was a wildly successful product. This was a big risk and it paid off. Why? Like, we're trying to get people to be vulnerable and authentic in front of one another. Because guess what? That's how people learn. That's how people gain confidence, and that's how people become willing to take a risk in their day job. Not that risk taking should be all we do. That's not what I mean. I mean that when I say take a risk, I mean get out of your comfort zone. And I think when people see other people getting out of their comfort zone or talking in a way that lets them know they did, it helps them do that. And that's the way we get better. That's the way we get better as a sector. That's the way we get better as individuals and as leaders. And that's the way we get better as an economy.
I want. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I agree with you 100%. I want to make sure that for everyone here, if there's a question that you'd like to ask, now is the time. So if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, we have Deb right in front of us. Feel free. If you're thinking of what that question could be, in the meantime, I have one question for you, Deb, which is looking back and again thinking of our audience of founders, venture-backed founders that are either in transition right now, they're going to their second company or whatever the case might be, or they're in the first one and they're building it, they're just beginning to find product market fit, or they already found product market fit, they're finding growth, whatever. What are there certain lessons that you feel you want to share? Anything that you say, hey, whatever you do and you walk away from this, like here's some things that were helpful for me, like looking back.
Sure. I think maybe the first one is kind of the most prevalent failure mode that I see early on in, at least in med tech and digital health, like in early stage companies, is groups, founders, leaders who are focusing on the right things, but they're doing it at the totally wrong time. And a lot of times it's very tempting to do in healthcare companies because there's so many binary modes of failure. You either get into clinical trials or you don't. You either have a safety signal or you don't, right? You either get paid by insurance companies or you don't, right? And so there's these binary modes of failure, but it doesn't mean that you start a company and worry about them all at the same time, right? Like effective use of capital is about de-risking a company to get to the next inflection point, right? And oftentimes those inflection points come most efficiently and profoundly when you're worrying about the right things at the right time, not the right things at the wrong time. And I see a lot of that sort of issue in early stage digital health companies. I think the second thing is, when building teams, look for track records, not pedigrees. Look for track records, not pedigrees. Look for people who have done stuff, who have lived through stuff, right? They've had real world experiences, whether it's big companies, small companies, or their educational pathways, right? If they haven't done that, I don't know. I kind of don't care what their pedigree is. You know what I mean? Like, and so that's just a thing that, Christine and I kind of live by, is like, look, we want people who've tried stuff, who've done stuff, who've learned from stuff, and are able to course correct really rapidly. And that's actually point 3. Failure is welcome, right? Like, it's how we get better. It's how we push through. It's how we change things. But I think what separates good companies from great ones, in my humble opinion, the great ones fail, they fail efficiently, they adapt, and they move quickly to the next step, right? They don't get mired in failure, in what it means to fail. And I think if you can learn early on to be very agile in your failure and not just agile in your operations, then you are setting yourself up to be an agile, adaptable company, which I think in this environment, which is always going to keep moving as fast as it is right now, sets you up to be able to handle what comes your way, right?
Deb, oh, here we go. Jerome has a question.
Hello, and thank you very much for the advice. I would like to hear your perspective on the product market fit in the early stage, especially because you touched on that already. But if you have, let's say you want to start a new business from scratch, you have already an idea, maybe an MVP, but you don't know exactly which target to focus on, or you have like 5 or 6
potential customers. Yeah.
Yeah, or persona, you have an idea, an intuition, you try to pitch, then you, and how do you go with it in the early stage, really, like until maybe you have, for example, in my case, we have already a couple of paying customers, but we don't know if they are, exceptions or good luck, or
Yeah.
or is it really like we tap into the right market? So what's your take on it?
Yeah, this is such a hard thing, and I don't have a magical answer, but I will tell you my philosophy and how to approach this problem is, in general, I think if you've got, let's say that you've got 3 customers, 2 of them are buying the same thing and the other one is buying something quite different. I think early on that's okay. That might mean that you have actually a portfolio of products, or it might mean you have a single product, but you haven't really nailed the feature set yet. And in our case, in healthcare, like I said earlier, the biggest risk is that your service layer is accommodating some of those feature sets that are specific to the compliance environment or the reimbursement environment or the regulatory environment for one of those customers, but not all of those customers. And so all that to say, what my philosophy is, look for the common denominators about those customers. What is it that they're buying that is the same? I mean, you may be delivering something slightly different to them. You may be using a product delivery that's quite, a channel or a vehicle that's quite different, but there's probably some underlying common denominator about what they're asking you to do. If you can nail that and follow that through, that's probably the answer. It's really hard to do, to find that common denominator, but to me, that's the thing you got to do. You got to do it, and you got to do it as quickly as you possibly can.
That's a great answer, and that's a great question, because many times founders assume, even when you have a paying customer, you assume that they're paying you for one particular thing, and you realize that that's not the actual core reason behind why they're paying you for it. So what you said, Deb, about finding that core commonality, I think that's great. That makes a lot of sense. Any other questions? And Tanya, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about being agile in your failure. I'm curious how you actually put that into practice, because it's way easier said than done, in my opinion. And so how did you actually create that culture? Did you have rituals? Like, what did you do personally to make sure that you led your team in that way?
Yeah, so, personally, I believe in selective postmorteming. What I mean by that
I was going to ask you if you do a postmortem every single time, because it's also exhausting.
It's too exhausting. And if you do that, then you also, I think the unintended consequence of postmorteming everything is that, guess what? You kind of get people not wanting to fail, which is actually kind of counter to the point, right? And so I think selective postmortem. I just had this conversation yesterday. It's so funny we're talking about it, because there's this thing that happened recently, and I was like, we have to postmortem that. It's really important. And I think 20 people need to be in the room, and then everybody, it needs to be talked about at the all employee meeting. This one's so big that there is an issue that is manifesting this particular mode of failure that I think is endemic, and it's deep, and we don't know it's there. So selectively postmorteming those events, which are really reflecting something deeply systemic that you think is going on, do not let those go, because those will be the ones that allow you to be agile in how you recover. And I frankly also think it helps create a culture of accountability, but not blame, right? The whole point of postmorteming something is so that you actually can trace through what happened and understand and course correct, but you're not trying to blame anybody, right? You're just trying to figure it out. And so I think, but that selectivity has got to be important. Otherwise you will fatigue everybody, right?
Yeah.
Love this.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Deb. I don't know what else to say other than I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you sharing your journey with us and your insights. And for everyone here, thank you for joining. We'll like I mentioned, we'll share this with the rest of the community.
This is awesome. Thanks for the authenticity. It's great. It shows.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Ricardo. So nice to meet all of you.
Take care. Bye-bye.